kick off with a band who are near and dear to many hearts here. Enter Shikari, A Kiss for the Whole World. The new album from the kind of beloved British rock band who have developed from their kind of, electronical beginnings to become something of an institution here now. And particularly, I guess, something of an island. Like, it doesn't feel like Enter Shikari are at all affected by changing tides or whatever here. Like, they came up around a whole bunch of Brit rock bands who we won't talk about. They endured past most of those breaking up the first time and still feel like exciting as a whole bunch of new bands then came through in the UK with your Marmosets and Creepers and all that. Enter Shikari was still fucking great. And now, I guess, the UK rock pendulum has swung over to things like Nova Twins, and Enter Shikari are still around, working. They're kind of very much in their own orbit.
Yeah, I think that was a bit, because they've never been a band you can easily just categorise as a Brit rock band. They've never, stuck to one lane. Like, it's always been, dance music and rock music / metalcore, hardcore kind of colliding, but they've always morphed that where they need to and kept it interesting, which has meant they've never had the sort of interest wane, and anytime it has, they've been able to find something new they can pull out of it, which has just kept them relevant as one of the sort of the top bands.
I think it's helped by the fact that they have a really unique and dexterous sound, what amazes me is, despite the popularity and how evidently influential they are, they've not really been ripped off by anyone, which I think, again, makes
it's difficult to do, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a tough formula to recreate. So they're not assigned to a certain era in the same way that like the Brit rock bands were, or even a lot of the electronical bands of the late 2000s are kind of in the bargain bin now.
Yeah, Sam, I'm curious as to where I guess you think Shikari are in their trajectory right now, both creatively and commercially. Like, if maybe around the time this podcast started in the middle of the last decade, we were thinking them as upcoming potential headliner type bands and all that kind of thing. They did download Pilot as lockdown was ending as headliners.
I mean, I think they kind of plateaued for like the last 5-6 years, I'd say. Like, they, you could probably see them reliably selling out Ali Pally anytime they want to. They're headlining Slam Dunk alongside The Offspring. Like, they are still a big deal band. They're never going to kind of like reach the O2 Arena, Bring the Horizon level, which is a shame. I think I always kind of wish that they would have, but they, they're in a very comfortable position, and they're in a position creatively where, again, they can still just be quite fearless, and people will go with it. They don't have to, stick to doing, like, no one's kind of clamouring for a Shikari to go back to the sound of Take to Your Skies or Common Dreads. Everyone's always just kind of happy for them to go where they want to go.
Yeah, they've firmly shown that they will like regularly do arena shows, and they're like, even when they just as often dip into doing smaller shows, kind of mainly out of choice, like as they have been doing with the release shows. That's it, yeah.
If they're doing small shows, album, it's because they want to.
Yeah. Creatively, I think what they've earned is trust, where they've done records that maybe not everyone was super wild about, like The Spark, which I like very much, but they've always shown that they're doing something, interesting, and then they come around to doing something like Nothing Is True and Everything Is Possible, which I think is on the very top rung of like the best works in Shikari's catalogue. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's like 5 Shikari records I think are all absolutely just like near like 10, and I would put that as one of those kind of like top tier Shikari records. Like, most of their catalogue I hold so dearly.
Yeah,
Spark being the only one I don't hold as dearly. Still really like that record. Like,
yeah, I don't even know if The Spark would necessarily be my least favourite. Like, I kind of liked everything. Like, I don't consider them to be one of the bands the closest to my heart that I've grown up with or whatever, but they've never let me down or made a record that I don't think is great. And that's the mindset that I enter Shikari, genuinely not intentional, kind of records with. Elliot, just to check in on you, Enter Shikari are a band incredibly beloved to a lot of people who tend to put them on a very high platform of kind of creativity and integrity, but they do have a very particular nature as a band sonically that still to this day has potential to rub people up the wrong way. I just want to check in if Shikari like appeal to you.
Well, it's a weird one because they're kind of one of the bands that I admire the most, whose music that I'm least fussed about. Because there's a few songs that I really like, and I mean, you say you didn't grow up with them. I don't know if I'd say I grew up with Enter Shikari, but they were kind of the independent success story.
You were 6 when Take to the Skies came out, or something like that.
But I have at least vague memories of like Common Dreads and that sort of thing, and then a flash flood of kind of, like, they were becoming a big band, and I was reading Kerrang every week, and they were clearly the most interesting of a lot of the bands that they were covering. So while I never really connect with them, I've always kind of kept up with them, and I listen to all the records whenever they come out, it's not a relationship I have with many bands.
Yeah, certainly. I can see that being very much the case, why people might keep tabs on even if they weren't fans. So this is the follow-up to me to potentially their best record. This was the album that we got latest in the day here for us on the show, so this is still quite fresh for us. It's coming out next week, I think, as this goes out. Part of Shikari albums is how they grow on you in the months and even years after their release. So this is off more kind of initial release first impressions from us. What are you thinking about A Kiss for the Whole World?
I mean, it starts off like the title track opening. I was kind of like, oh, cool, this is, Shikari blend that kind of classical touch with their dance punk rave kind of thing. Like, very uplifting. I was kind of like, here we go, we're in for another Shikari record. We get the You're Still Standing Like a Statue callback, which scattered all throughout this record. And I was kind of just like, immediately kind of greeted by this really warm sound of like trumpets and synth and guitars all kind of coming together, roused vocals, just really just distinct, like such a clear character to him. And it was kind of like, yeah, cool, let's settle in for another round of Shikari. And then it kind of like, I don't know if that's entirely what I got from this. So like, as the sort of record, again, I'm still processing this quite freshly, so I need to spend a bit more time with it. But it's there's a few kind of like things I wasn't necessarily expecting from this record.
I mean, again, speaking of someone who's not a massive fan, I think this is a bit of a strange record in their catalogue, because on one hand, it's one of their sort of least garish and sort of assaults on the ears things. It's probably their most euphoric, maybe. But at the same time, there's stuff on here which is really out of left field and quite dizzying. And some of it, I think, really adds to the record. And some of it, I think, detracts quite badly.
Okay. For me, I found this to be, like, if not my favourite Shikari material. I mean, what I said about their albums growing. The thing about Shikari albums is, like, the true extent of it grows on you. But the initial, like, burst of life and energy in it is at the same time kind of so instantaneous. And the melodies on this record and the pace and the colours of it, like Enter Shikari records are always so colourful. That's why I just went like, no one else does it like them. Like, they are the only band that we review on this show who could give us something that sounds like Bloodshot.
Yeah, no, I think this is what I expected, is because after the last album was, again, really quite expansive and goes in all these places, this is, in a way, like, quite simplified by Shikari standards. It's, it's 12 tracks, but, only 9 of them are songs. They've kind of really just gone, let's just go for this sugar rush of an album, essentially.
It feels like there's less to chew on here than there is on Nothing Is True. Or I guess in a way, like, you could have said the same thing about The Spark following the Minesweep. There is that kind of, like, big, expansive record too. Like, The Spark is quite a euphoric, immediate, poppy kind of record.
Yeah, no, I think this is closely comparable to The Spark in that regard, in that it's a step away from the expansive side into, like I say, just big, bright, euphoric melodies. Again, it's not just simple pop songs. There's still loads of little, like, touches and ideas going on in there. It's just 32. It's like 34 minutes long. It's really to the point. And, like, none of the songs go over 4 minutes. They are just punchy, like, energetic, bright pop songs. But again, it's those melodies that are just so immediately sticky and just really, really uplifting and bright.
Yeah, I mean, comparing this to the last record, which I thought was probably one of the better ones overall, and it really seemed to animate the fan base. So I would accept I'm sort of in the minority of not thinking it's brilliant. I would agree with sort of both of your assessments. This feels like a maybe less ambidextrous record, but I wouldn't say it's as sort of stark, and I wouldn't say the spark is basic, but there is something kind of almost pared back about it. Yeah,
I think this is maybe more multi-dimensional than that, if we were going to use that as the comparison point. For me, like I said about the kind of instantaneousness, you get that title track with the opening trumpet fanfare that's like, I like when Enter Shikari records sound like kind of big, grandiose, bright statements from the get-go like that. And then the riff comes in, and I love how fucking, like, CBBC music it is when it boots off. But then when you got that and you put that, and we're running for our lives now melody on it, it's just super, like, slick and buoyant, where that is just a great life-affirming banger that you want from Shikari. It'll be brilliant live. Then you get Please Set Me On Fire, which works, I think, a little better following it up than it was as the single. Kind of gets that boisterousness with the the big 90s dance euphoric hook and like Latin carnival beats and stuff like that. It is a very like animating start to a record, and I think this is destined to be the Shikari album, I guess, that when you look back on it, it's powered by a sense of release, because the pandemic is the least Shikari will have played their whole career, right? Like, they are one of those bands where you imagine it must have been particularly weird for them to have not been able to play a show for a year and a half because of how everywhere they've always been. And this is very much their post-COVID album. Like, the album cover even is like this one flower in a wasteland that's like blooming again and coming back to life. So this album doesn't feel like it is the largest statement of their career, if maybe that's what you're really looking to Shikari for at their kind of their highest peaks. Like when you got records like The Minesweep, and it was so cinematic while painting this picture about like, you know, the banking system or the NHS or whatever, that made it feel like this huge explosive kind of microcosm of the world. And then Nothing Is True, Everything Is Possible, which just made me feel like really just, kind of joy in the face of, kind of doom, if you will. This record doesn't have that kind of real incisiveness. Instead, it just feels like this big burst of like shaking the rust off and being excited about making music together.
Yeah, I think that kind of like release of just pent up energy. Like, they are a bright, bubbling band like at normal times. So if you've had that like building up over, like, say, a year and a half, and now they can just kind of go, boom, let's shake it all off, and let's just like. That's kind of like the whole like let's kiss for the whole world. It's kind of like let's heal, let's get back together, let's stand resolute against, like, again, it's still a very much like a rallying cry for sort of standing up against things, but it's just kind of like it's a coming together record and celebrating we're still here and all that. Like,
I think the record's euphoric quality is probably its most endearing characteristic, because the title track, it's such a commanding opener, both of like your attention, but also just this, like you say, a rallying cry sort of to get you involved. And I think the first three songs, they kind of all do it in different ways, but it's all very like quite clean, sophisticatedly performed kind of pop music, but with a much more fizzy and exciting quality that Enter Shikari are kind of unique in having, among their peers at least.
Yeah, certainly. I think melodically this band are so instantaneous, where the biggest tool in their arsenal at this point, genuinely, it isn't the genre blending or anything. It isn't the obnoxious fucking raggo beatdowns. It's just pure song power, and how those melodies are able to, like, beam down from the heavens and kind of speak directly to you and lift your mood. And when they do a record that's just purposed about that, like, it does lift you up in that way. You mentioned the first three songs. The third one is It Hurts, isn't it? Which just, first time you hear it, properly hits you, and immediately you want to hear that chorus live, and that, but your worth doesn't change at all, kind of galvanizing a crowd of people. You can just picture it in your head. And then that does have one of those like proper old school Shikari breakdowns with like strange, unique sounding electronic percussion.
Middle,
it makes it sound like a fucking spaceship or whatever. And when they fuse those sensations together, it's just like, this is what Shikari does. Again, Bloodshot, really catchy with that kind of falsetto meets like robo voice thing or whatever. And Leap Into the Lightning, just totally going for that kind of like throw your caution away and grab life in the moment kind of exhilaration that they are really, it feels like in the last few records they have really been basing a lot of their kind of identity around that kind of, to quote Napalm Death, throws a joy in the jaws of defeatism. But they execute those things really well by putting the dynamics of like all that other stuff around them. Like the verses in that song are very strange, and then you just get that like big, let's go.
Leap Into the Lightning is one of my favourites on the record. I mean, always down for music that sounds like it could be on the Wipeout video games, like when the electronic beats and all that. But then, that chorus of just like the kind of like just not waiting for things to get better, actively confronting it, throwing yourself into sail into the Bermuda Triangle, like just fully just that joy, like that again, that standing up in the face of adversity. It's really rousing, and I'm just like, rouse melodies and what he can just get out of it. Like, and I think that's one of their best weapons as always, is him as a vocalist. Like, the melodies he can come out with just sound so joyous when he really lets it all out, and that's when that has it in that, again, that like standing up against like the darkness,
and then particularly for me in that just that kind of that burst of like, you know, fizzy anxiety and then positive energy together. When Jailbreak comes in, you know from Raoul's melody straight away that it's going to be a good one, and when that surges upwards on like the drum and bass beat and everything, it's just, they do those things and it's very invigorating.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think if we're comparing this to, well, not to keep going back to it, but if we do compare it to The Spark, I remember Raoul around that time saying something like, you know, the world was in such a shit place that they needed pop music as a way of like reaching people. And I think this record, overall, for some of its faults, I think it's way stronger at doing that particular thing. Like the sort of euphoric, dizzying, eccentric songwriting is so much more successful this time around. Like if we are going to compare those records sort of 1-to-1.
Okay, the Spark worked for me, so I am just perfectly happy for them to keep plying music that's joyous like that. What are, for you, you've kind of beat around the bush a little bit in terms of like, there are parts on this record for you, again, as the non-fan amongst us, that like you say slightly derail it. What are the moments that don't work for you?
Well, so one of the things with Enter Shikari is they're kind of on 10 almost all the time, which isn't always a problem, but it means that sometimes they kind of overshoot. Like there's not, everything they do is kind of with the subtlety of a train wreck, like for better or for worse for me. And something like Dead Wood, which to me sounded like Imagine Dragons covering Queen.
Oh no,
something.
I love Deadwood.
Oh.
I love Deadwood. Like I think them going full classical with the strings and everything, it just works for them because again, it's the sincerity of the delivery of it just makes me buy in. And when you get that crescendo at the end and everything is just coming all at once, like in this most grand way, I think it sounds great.
I think that's the one bit of the record that seems to nod at like Nothing Is True, because Nothing Is True had that like everything Enter Shikari have done placed in this like masterful, delicate kind of, you know, railroad. The rock meets orchestration, everything that they had going on there. This record isn't as far-reaching as that, and Deadwood is like a bit of an outlier where it's not one of my favourite tracks on the record, but I like that. Again, that deviation that just kind of makes you take notice and nods his hat to that kind of thing. There's also a bit in that where Raoul just goes like, ah! Like he's having a meltdown at the masked ball.
It's like stood on a piece of Lego.
Yeah,
like...
I think that, again, when I asked you about your thoughts in general, Elliot, at the beginning on Enter Shikari, like they are a band who just, because of the reasons you're saying, they can just wind people up. They can just sound grating to people, and if you don't click with everything they do, I can understand why that would be a moment. But if you're in the world and you're just kind of going with them, yeah, I've never really had a problem with anything they've done that much.
Well, it's a funny thing because, you know, maybe I'd like Deadwood more if the record was sequenced a bit better. Because, like I say, not a big fan.
It does sort of. It is a hard left turn, isn't it?
Well, I get that the hard left turns and the deviations are kind of part of the excitement for an Enter Shikari fan. But like after the sort of feed your soul drum and bass freakout to go into this, well, for me, like quite cloying bit of balladeering that really sort of pulls the brakes on the record. On one hand, you go, "Ah, isn't it cool to be surprised?" But then the record kind of struggles to get its momentum again after that.
Right. I think for me, it's just in that song. It really sounds like he's saying, "Maybe I'm Ed Wood." Talking about the sequence thing, I think for me, the point where I would look at it is on the closer front. It doesn't really go for one of their kind of big sweeping moments, like Giant Pacific Octopus and its corresponding outro. Good tracks. They just don't necessarily feel like obvious closers. The record seems to just sort of end for me.
I noticed that, like, Shikari albums always end on a real kind of grand statement, whether it's Constellations or, like, the Minesweep 2, like, things like that. They are always ending in, like, the grandest way possible. And this is kind of like, here's just a really, like, big, boisterous pop song with a kind of extended outro. And I was kind of like, okay, cool. I was kind of expecting more from the closer, but I think it's a good song, like, and I don't know if Deadwood maybe would have worked better at the end of the record, potentially, because that's got that grand sort of
but then again,
moment.
like Elliot said, it's the slightly more dour song, and I don't think they would want to end a record on a moment of kind of unhappiness. Like that doesn't sound like Enter Shikari at all at the moment. I think for me, it just, like, again, it's a good song. It just the Giant Pacific Octopus track, I mean, it just contributes to the record feeling like quite slight for Enter Shikari, which I wasn't necessarily expecting. It's not.
I had a bit of a hyperpop charity single to it, which And like I said, I went in with sort of all the goodwill, and then by the end, I was like,
I don't know why there's like a aquatic theme going on at the end there, because there's goldfish as well.
Goldfish.
But even like really bright chorus, even with how funny the lyrics are. You are under my control. You are a goldfish.
I am a bowl.
Hey, sure. But I don't know. Ralph's delivery and everything, he makes those things feel, kind of lovely and warm. I don't think it's really the album for ragers either. Like, it's not their gnarliest record by any means. Which
this is one of my only gripes. Is like, there's a lot of songs where they're like, they'll do a guitar riff and like, oh, that's really cool, and it's gone.
Like, like Goldfish has quite a cool riff as well.
But they drop it really quick, and that's one of my only kind of real gripes beyond the record being a little bit slight. I'm just like, that's a cool riff. You could have done more of that, but then you've dropped it. And again, maybe that's just kind of like they're just in the pop vibe, so they just want the the guitar to kind of like sequence into something else, and where they're just pulling from all these different areas. But it's one thing I was like, you could have done more with that.
Like I said, I quite like them kind of going all pop on this record and not being so aggressive, because sometimes that's cool, but there are times on past Enter Shikari records where, like you say, when they go all out, it can be pretty grating. And I think if you did have that on this record, it might feel like too much of an outlier, but at the same time, maybe to offset things like Deadwood, it would help to have something a bit more, balls to the wall.
Yeah, they are, as you mentioned, Sam, they're kind of in their fucking Fall Out Boy self-referential phase on this one. Like, there are so many lyrical
all over
bits
the record, like
lifted from old songs. Like, starts off still standing like a statue. He goes to live outside at one point.
Goes to the Dreamers Hotel.
Like, right after the live outside line, they nick unto others hawk noise. They've joined the Eagle Revolution. I'm not sure where that comes from. And then even musically as well, the Bloodshot Coda, to me, it sounds like a bit of a musical cannibalization of is it System Meltdown that starts
sort of
with the strings part that lifts
yeah.
up. But then they kind of put more like brass and stuff on it they haven't used before.
I quite like how with the Bloodshot they can kind of take some of the melodies of that like quite dance heavy track and do them with the strings and trumpets, and whilst kind of evoking previous songs. I think that's kind of a cool extension of that song.
I think all of those name drops and stuff on there, it's always a bit eye rolling. But if this is their moment of like, we couldn't be together for a bit, but now we are back and we're all still here, and kind of acknowledging that kind of journey they're on, and if that's what this record is for them, fine. I think this is another strong album from them. I've just not falling for it quite as dramatically as I did Nothing Is True and Everything Is Possible, but it's good.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same camp. I do like this, and I think again the reference is kind of ties into the celebratory vibe of them just kind of like be like, yep, let's look back at the past, let's celebrate it all. I think this is going to be one I'll stick with a bit longer and see if anything else jumps at me. But I'm still, there's a bunch here I'm excited to see them play at Slam Dunk. Like, it's doing that job. So yeah, just another good Shikari record.